Welcome to Berries in the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome everybody back to In the Interim, a podcast on innovative clinical trial design, Bayesian trials design, science of clinical trials. I'm your host, Scott Berry. And I have two guests today, two wonderful guests, and I'll introduce the topic. First, I'll introduce our guests, Dr. Anna McGlothlin, who is a director and senior statistical scientist here at Berry Consultants, and Dr. Michelle Detry, who is a senior statistical scientist and director at Berry Consultants. And they are both directors of implementation and execution of innovative trial designs. We have here at Berry Consultants, we have a group that specializes in the implementation of innovative trial design. So first, welcome to In the Interim.
Thanks for having us. Yes, thank you.
And especially the name In the Interim, that in the interim of our trial designs is rather apropos as you guys spend your time in the interim. You live in the interim in this. So it would be great if you describe to our listeners what is implementation of adaptive trials, Anna?
So what we do is when a trial has been designed that has an adaptive feature in it and has an interim analysis that's going to look at data partway through the trial, we are the group that receives that interim data, that performs the pre-specified analyses that are defined in the protocol and the statistical analysis plan, and then communicates to either a DSMB, for example, or whoever's going to operationalize that decision, whether any specific triggers have been met, such as early stopping, maybe it's met a futility rule, maybe there's an update to randomization probabilities. So we're the group that is cranking the models underneath the hood and checking those against the pre-specified design and making sure that the design does what it was intended to do.
And there was a time at Berry Consultants, we're approaching our 25th anniversary. So we've been around designing innovative trials, and I should back up. So Anna, how long have you been at Berry Consultants?
I've been here 12 years.
And Michelle?
I just hit 14.
14. So we've been at this a while.
Yep.
And both of you worked for a while in the design. So we are designing innovative trials, adaptive trials, and we'll get into what does some of those look like, but multiple interim analyses, adaptive aspects to them. And we didn't at Berry Consultants worry much about the implementation or the running of the adaptive trials, but it became necessary for us to get involved in the running of the interim analyses. And Anna and I were involved in one particular project where we designed an adaptive trial that was supposed to do an interim analysis when 100 patients were enrolled in the trial. And the company came back to us when 100 were enrolled, and they had paused for 9 months waiting for it to reach a threshold, and they came back to us, and Anna and I looked at each other like, oh no, they in some large part, a disastrous outcome for them within the setting was exemplified why we had to get involved in running trials if we were going to design innovative trials. Running them is critically important to the success of these trials.
Yeah, and I think what happened there and what often happens is the people we work with on the design, there's often a lot of turnover. And sometimes people that we worked with who knew the design, knew what was supposed to happen, if they move on, sometimes we're the only people who still know what the design was intended to do. So I think that's where the ball got dropped in that case, and something that we are now aware of and look out for.
Yeah, and I think also there's this perception that when an interim is triggered, that the enrollment should pause. And I think that's something like through design in our, our experience with adaptive trials is we don't want the enrollment or the randomization to pause in a trial. In clinical trials, it's hard enough to get enrollment started and generate momentum and the sites are on board and everyone gets going. And if you have a pause, you lose that momentum. And often there's this perception that you're supposed to pause when you hit it. And so I think one of the other things we do is a lot of consulting on how to do this while not pausing and to be efficient and quick in doing the interim analysis because enrollment is continuing in the background.
So the FDA guidance on adaptive trials spends about half of its time on operational bias and really the running of it and who knows what when during the course of it. So a huge part of that is that by also pausing enrollment sends external signals that an adaptive, something's happening within that. And largely we would like the adaptive part of the trial to be invisible to sites, that these analyses might be happening in the background, and we might do 20 adaptive analyses during the course of a trial, and sites don't know the difference in the course of the trial until, of course, something happens to patient enrollment or the stopping of the trial in the course of that. So let's talk about the process of this. Maybe an interesting thing, Michelle, is what is different and what is extra that's needed in an adaptive trial for the implementation that might not be there in a fixed trial? For people out there that are used to fixed trials, what's different?
Yeah, I think a lot of things that are different are things that you normally would do at the end when the trial's completed and you're locking the data and bringing it in and doing queries and looking for completeness. Some of that gets moved earlier in the trial. Because when you do an interim analysis, you want to have good quality data on which to make your decisions. But it doesn't mean that it's locked data. So it's not the same processes of locking the data, but you want to be able to have good quality data because you want to make the correct decisions because, like Anna described earlier, you're going to make decisions as far as maybe stopping enrollment, changing randomization probabilities, enriching to a population. And you want to make sure that decision was made off of good quality data. So often what we find is when we work with people is processes they may have at the end, we have to move some of that earlier, but we do this in a way to try to make it as efficient as possible, not to add extra burden. So, things that we do are identify a key subset of variables that are needed at the interim analyses that the sites can focus on making sure they're up to speed on entering and it's complete, that the monitoring is there to make sure sites, to help the sites know that they need to be up to date on these, that queries are being generated and completed for these key variables. But it's not the totality of the database because that's a large amount of data. So I think one of the big differences and one of the misconceptions is some of the stuff that happens at the end now needs to happen earlier, but you can do it in a way that it's not overly burdensome. And so we kind of help with that through advising and consulting and understanding the processes that we can help the groups be able to implement and be ready to do this. So it's not just running a statistical model. Anna and I spend a lot of time on the preparation as far as how this is going to work and trying to help groups so that and how that fits in with their processes.
So your colleague, Mark Fitzgerald, talks quite a bit that doing that earlier is sometimes therapeutic in the trial, that you discover uncertainties, weird things that you wouldn't have discovered till the trial was over. But because of this process, you discovered earlier in times to intervene?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can identify, by doing this, you get kind of a leg up on identifying where there may have been problems. Maybe there was a misunderstanding with sites on how things were entered into the database or how things are to be measured. And by doing these interim analyses and having the focus on the variables used in interim analyses, but often the primary outcomes, so your key variables in the trial, you can sometimes catch issues that when you got to the end of the trial, lock the data, may be hard to recover from. And so I think it is definitely a good thing is it gives it gives the trial a better benefit to identify problems earlier before it gets too far along.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so sort of take the listeners and me. I don't do implementation, so you help take me through the process of this. Scott, or a statistician at Berry Consultants, designs a trial, 10 adaptive analyses, maybe response adaptive randomization in a phase 2-3 seamless trial kind of thing. And you're getting involved in the implementation of this. Sometimes you actually form a named group, a statistical analysis committee, an independent statistics group, something. What is the process of this? Are you always chartered? Do you create a charter to this? Are you separate from the DSMB? Sort of take us through the process before you receive any data of what happens, Anna.
Sure, and I might ask Michelle to jump in here because this is her specialty, but we're not always formally a chartered group. It depends a lot on the trial and what the needs of the trial are. But the purpose of forming this group is to identify who's going to know the data, who knows what when. So the naming of the individuals who are going to have access to that unblinded data in the trial. And we at Berry make sure that we set up a firewall so that those of us who are on that unblinded side looking at the real trial data are not talking to anybody who is maybe on the design side, could still influence how the design is working. So we have that very clear separation between the groups. And that's one reason why we might want to put a formal charter in place, is to just lay out who those named individuals are, set up processes for how we communicate with each other, how we communicate with a DSMB, how we communicate with the sponsor. In some cases, that information may already be set out. It may already be in the DSMB charter, or there may be a separate communication plan. So in those cases, we may not need to create a formal charter, but if it's not somewhere else, then this is a good place to put all of that down in writing before we receive unblinded data.
Yeah. And so on these trials, your typically your interaction point is, well, we'll talk about the point of where you get the data. Well, we haven't sort of gotten to that point. But your interaction is typically with the DSMB, Michelle?
It often is. Once we are unblinded and perform the interim analyses, we have extensive, prior to unblinding in the preparation phase, we have extensive collaborations with the trial team. The trial team, maybe the statisticians, it may be operations, things like that. But once we're unblinded and actually conducting the interim analyses, it's most often with the DSMB. The DSMB is the one that is charged with communicating information back to a designated contact. So they're a very natural group to be able to communicate what the interim analysis says to do. It's not so much that they're deciding what to do, but they're checking to make sure that the interim analysis was able to be conducted as planned according to the protocol, and then communicating what the protocol said to do back to their contact. So we work a lot with DSMBs. We work a lot on defining this communication channel, like Anna was saying. And there are some situations where the type of adaptations do not require it to go through a DSMB. So that may have a designated sponsor contact that's separate from the trial team and separate from day-to-day trial activities. Getting back to that operational bias concern that you were talking about, where we're trying to mitigate any sort of information being shared with individuals to which it should not be shared. So there's different ways to do it. And that depends on, if we have something like that, we would probably have a separate charter. But otherwise, our role is often included in the DSMB charter just to have one document where everything's in one place, because we're talking with the DSMB, and it's a great place to have that.
Yep. Okay, so in the trial, you have a data safety monitoring board who are chartered to worry about patient safety in the trial, the scientific credibility of the trial. We won't get into the issue, but they're unblinded. We won't get into issues where they're not unblinded, which none of us agree with. But circumstance, they're seeing the data. That happens in every clinical trial. Well, in almost all clinical trials, not every trial, but most clinical trials have a data safety monitoring board. There are some that are exempt from it, low risk and that, but largely the trials we're talking about have a data safety monitoring board. And that's typical of all trials. But now there's this additional, we'll call it a statistical analysis committee. It tends to be statisticians. It tends to be the group that is going to implement the pre-specified design within it. And there may be communications. They're unblinded. The Statistical Analysis Committee certainly unblinded to carry out the pre-specified analyses in the design. So these are two groups. The DSMB will be there in most clinical trials. The Statistical Analysis Committee is somewhat specific to innovative adaptive trials and the need for that. Okay, so now what is the process before you receive the data for the first interim? So you're planning out the first interim may be triggered by a patient enrollment, patient exposure at some point in the trial. It's predefined when that happens. So what are the steps that you're doing before the time somebody says, okay, here's the data? What are you doing in that time?
Yeah, I can start and Michelle jump in. So I think our first step is just making sure we understand the design. So usually with an adaptive design, there's a write-up. At Berry, we usually call this the adaptive design report that just lays out what the design is, when the interims happen, what triggers them, what the model is that's going to analyze the data, what the population is, and all of the different decision rules that are possible at the interim. So the first step is just making sure we understand all of that we know when the interims happen, we understand the model. We'll go through the statistical analysis plan, make sure that everything is very clearly written out. And this is our chance to ask questions. So if we are going through and we find that there's a place of ambiguity about what to do in a particular situation, or maybe what the model is prior didn't get written down or something, this is our chance to find that, to ask about it, get it written down. And then once
Anna,
we're...
and just to add on that, I think also one of the things that we often find and, have interested in your additional thoughts on this is we're approaching this from the perspective of implementing a pre-specified plan. And it's often a different perspective from maybe when was designing it, the trial. And so I think just wanted to cue in on that point you made about, maybe a priors are usually there, but maybe there may be some piece which is not fully specified or it's not clear to us. Yeah. And so I think that's a big thing that we spend a good chunk of time on, is that we do have the pre-specified plan. So I don't know if you want to give any examples of that, because there have been some trials, we can't always talk about all the details, but where you've had some great insights into details that need to be added that weren't necessary for the simulating the design phase, but were crucial for implementing it.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add to the question, what are things that maybe the pre-specified plan aren't detailed enough? Is that missing data? Is it, what are the things that you really worry about? Because all of a sudden when you're unblinded, now it's unclear what to do here.
Yeah, missing data is a big one. So that's always on my radar to look for. And a lot of times, if we have a model that's using covariates, for example, we may have been good and caught, okay, here's how we're going to handle missing outcome data. But if you're missing a covariate, we also need to know how we should handle that in the model. So that's a big one. The population that we're using is another one that I always ask a lot of questions about. So especially if the analysis population is not strictly ITT, if it's maybe some modified ITT, so maybe it's patients who are randomized and also treated. And then I usually have questions about what that means for the maximum sample size. So there may be a trial that has a pre-specified futility rule, for example, that's looking at what's the predictive probability that the trial is going to be successful at the maximum sample size. And if that's a small probability, the trial would stop. But we would need to understand when it says maximum sample size, is that number randomized or is that number randomized and treated? And then if so, how do we estimate that when we're at an interim? where we don't necessarily know how many patients are going to be treated out of those randomized. So those are the kinds of questions that we've learned over the years of doing these that we need to look out for. I don't know, Michelle, anything to add to that?
Even missing data is weird at an interim. So you might have a plan that says what to do with missing data at the end, but sometimes your missing data is the patient's actually gone in some way. They may be missing, or it might just be time delayed and is a different kind of missing data.
Right. And I think we had an example one time of a trial that had specified that at the final analysis, any patient who was missing their data would be imputed as a failure or something like that. But we needed to be clear that at the interim, just because a patient was missing their data didn't mean they should be considered a failure. It might just be that they hadn't got to that visit yet. So again, just making sure all those details are really clear for whoever's going to be running it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with that is you were talking about the incomplete versus missing. Well, often as statisticians, when we talk about missing data, we mean that the data is just not available. And we often have to deal with understanding incomplete data where it still may be coming. And so understanding the impact of that. And so one of the other things that we spend a lot of time on is understanding the different variables and how they're collected and how quickly they may be available in the database. Sometimes things have to have scans, and that takes times for scans to be completed, or if they're lab values and they're run in batches, or there's adjudication being done, and an adjudication committee has to meet and review it. So Anna and I deal a lot with thinking about how these things impact data availability and how that impacts the pre-specified design with when an interim is supposed to be triggered and what may be available. So we may go back to the design team with a lot of questions, asking for details, how to handle this, refinement, as well as working with the operations team to understand availability of data and what kind of time it takes.
Okay, so now you're trying to consume the design, the statistics of the design. You're clarifying and you're anticipating weird things that can happen, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about weird things that happen for you. But so now you're getting to the point where you feel comfortable with the design. Now, are you interacting with how you're going to receive data, statistical models? What's the next set of work that happens? Michelle?
So I think the next step, well, there's things that go along in parallel flow. It's not definitely a clear set of steps in an order. But I think one of the next steps is a data dictionary, where I kind of alluded to this earlier, where we identify, Anna just said, we're understanding the design, we're understanding which data elements are needed to run this pre-specified analyses. And then we work on writing up a data dictionary of what is needed. And that's very much a collaborative, iterative process with the trial team, with the client, to understand how that matches with how things are being collected from the ECRFs. And so writing out then this dictionary of, okay, these are the things that we need to conduct the interim, and these are only the things that we need to conduct the interim. So it does two things. It identifies a nice subset of data that can hopefully be pulled quicker and an analysis data set for the interim be created quicker. And then it also identifies those key variables that we discussed are needed for monitoring and cleaning, not just cleaning for data entry errors, but for completeness. So sites can be trained, monitors can be watching this, making sure the sites are up to date on getting these things in. And then also cleaning can be done in preparation of an interim analysis. And then the data dictionary often requires a lot of interesting interactions, because Anna talked a little bit about this, but we have to define this thing called opportunity to complete. We have to understand if the participants in the trial could have had the opportunity to complete the visit where the outcome was recorded, and knowing if we should expect it. So when we get the data, if there's a data element that's not there, we need to understand, is it not there because they didn't yet reach that time point, so it's okay for it not to be there? If it's missing because maybe they dropped out and they ended their participation in the study, or if it's incomplete and it should have been there. And a lot of this ties into then what the design says as far as how an imputation method may be used or how it may be handled. Anna alluded to that as some things missing may be treated as failures, but there may be different imputation considerations that may be used based upon what's happening in the data. So we spend a lot of time on defining what we need, and then so that when the data is provided to us, it's very clear.
Now, you also want in that process test runs before the real run to iron out issues, interpret it, and then you're making sure that you have the data format as you described this, so that you can then run the appropriate statistical models in this. So let's assume you've done this test run, and I'll come to potential issues of that. So now you're getting to the point where the timing of the first interim's coming. Now, what does that process look like? We're going to ask about how long this takes, but from the time, now let's assume, as Anna described, we're not pausing enrollment, patients are being randomized, and on June 1st, you receive a data set. You know what that's going to look like, you know the format, you receive this secure transfer, you now receive this data set. What happens now from that point to moving forward?
So as Michelle has mentioned, we try to be really efficient in turning our analyses around, recognizing that patients are still being enrolled. We want to get to a decision as quick as possible. So we'll have everything that we can set up ahead of time. So we'll have all of our programs written. We always create a program that writes a report up that has summary tables and figures. So all of that, as much as possible, we do ahead of time so that once we get that data, we can run it through the model, create our report. We always have a lot of checks in place and verification processes. So there's always somebody that's looking through, checking that the model is correct, checking that our summaries are correct. And then we always like to have time to just think and make sure the models make sense, make sure that we aren't missing something, that something hasn't gone completely off the rails. We often will compare the data that we received at an interim to the data we received at the previous interim to check if something weird happened, patients disappeared, we have fewer mortality events this time than we did last time, things like that, that raise a flag that says something's not right. So we always want to make sure that we have time, not just to hit a button and run an analysis and spit out a table, but to think and make sure that the results we're producing make sense.
So in the world of AI, of course, you could imagine that thinking this could be entirely automated. Data goes in, models are run, and there's no human involvement in that. But it's critical to have experienced people who make sure things look right. And you found multiple issues, whether it's data, whether it's models. So it's a critical aspect to this to have experienced humans looking at it and not AI-driven interim analyses?
Yeah, for sure. I think we've seen a lot of things where we think we've got everything ready to go. And then as we are sitting and thinking about it, talking through it as a team, somebody will raise an issue that, yeah, this can't be right. And we'll maybe have to go and ask a question about the data or, dig into the model, see if there's some kind of convergence issue or something going on. So I think that's a really critical aspect of this. And we're going to have to be the ones to explain this. So once we complete our report and we send it to the DSMB, they have a chance to review it. And then we'll have a DSMB meeting where we walk through the report with them and allow them the opportunity to ask questions. So we want to make sure that we're prepared for the questions that they might ask. If they see something strange, that we know that we've done our due diligence and can stand behind the results and the decisions that are being recommended by the model.
Yeah. So how long does this take? You receive the data. How long do you generally give yourself for this? And I know the world of this at the end of a trial, people talk about 3 months to clean data and run analyses, and typically months at the end. For a typical adaptive analysis in a trial, how long do you guys generally have to do these, Michelle?
So our goal is 5 business days for when we receive the data to when we send the result to the DSMB. Now, of course, there's always an it depends on that. There may be situations where there are many models that need to be run. And I know we're not going to talk about platform trials here, but sometimes there's more that needs to be done in interim where the 5 days is not sufficient. But that's our target when we start. And the way that we meet that target is by the preparation ahead of time, all those things Anna mentioned of getting all our programs in place so that when we get the data, we jump in, we're looking at it, we understand, all our programs are written, and we're really thinking about what's coming in and what the models are saying to do and whether this is correct. And if we map this out well ahead of time, things can be turned around really quickly. So if you think about that, it takes us, the 5 business days to do our part, but we also work ahead of time to make sure for when the trigger is met to us getting data, that's as short as possible. So there's not often like Scott, you were alluding to the 3 months. Often that's where the time comes into play, is that there's this perception of needing to take the data and clean it for months and get it all ready before it's sent to us. And so that's where we also advise on how to do that quicker, or not necessarily quicker, but start it earlier, so that when so between trigger, us getting the data and us sending it to the DSMB can be as quickly as possible. And often our target for when the trigger is hit to us getting data is like 2 to 3 business days. We've had trials where we get data the next day because we've been able to, prepare with the group ahead of time. They know what they're extracting. It's limited. The programs are in place. But it's, often 2 to 3 business days. But again, some of that too is flexible depending upon the accrual of the design. If you have a very fast accruing trial, you're going to want to be more efficient and have these timeframes as short as possible. But if you have a really slow accruing trial, like in a rare disease, just for feasibility purposes, that may be lengthened between trigger hitting and us getting the data, just to allow for feasibility purposes. But again, we always target for us the 5 business days, but I'm always going to put that with an asterisk, and it depends, because it's really going to depend on the underlying model. But that's our initial target we start with.
Yeah. Okay. So now you receive the data, you run the model, you run the pre-specified model, and now you're interacting with the DSMB, and maybe triggers have been hit for futility. Anna, you talked about enrichment designs. This might be that certain patients are now excluded from future randomization, so that could be done. Randomization probabilities could change, enrollment could stop. Trial could go from phase 2 to phase 3 and all of this. So now you're running the models, and your interaction is with the DSMB. And DSMBs in adaptive trials are different than typical trials. So how is that interaction, how does that typically go?
Mm-hmm. So one thing we always try to do is before we get to the first interim analysis, we'd like to have a conversation with the DSMB. A lot of times they may already have meetings scheduled that they're looking at safety before we ever get to the first interim. So we like to have an opportunity to come to one of those meetings before we're unblinded, before we get to the interim, and have someone talk them through the design, have the sponsor or whoever was involved in designing the trial just describe the design to them, make sure that they understand what they're going to see when they get to an interim, and make sure that everyone's on the same page about the role of the DSMB in an adaptive trial, because so much work has gone into creating this adaptive design, understanding how it works, understanding that, the type 1 error rate is controlled, that it has the characteristics that you want it to have in terms of power or, how likely it is to stop. So you want to make sure the DSMB understands that these rules are pre-specified, that these are not just guidelines, that these are expected, that if one of these decisions is reached, that's what's going to be followed and recommended. Of course, the DSMB has this very important role of monitoring safety, and they may have additional recommendations that they need to pass along to the sponsor in their role, but to make sure they understand the design and their role in communicating the decision from the adaptive design is a little bit different than their typical role.
Yeah. So do you get circumstances, and we talk about this a lot, that the DSMB's role at that point is not to redesign the trial. As Anna described, the design is there, the protocol's there. Is there Is that a struggle in some of these circumstances, that the DSMB may not like the design at that point, or redesigns it at that point?
There are some situations where that has happened, and I guess like the way we try to address that is exactly through what Anna said about having this kickoff meeting ahead of time, of making sure that the DSMB understands the design well in advance of the interim analysis. DSMBs, when they sign on to be a DSMB member, they ultimately agree to the protocol. And so that is a time where if they disagree with the protocol, disagree with the design, that they have a time to express those recommendations if there are some, or to consider whether if they have like a fundamental disagreement with the design, that's a consideration if maybe they're not the best to be on the DSMB. But that, in advance of an interim, of having that in an open session, is the time to do that and have everyone get on the same page. And when I'm serving on a DSMB, I always take that time to ask all the questions to make sure that scientifically, I agree with the design. And again, it doesn't mean that it's the exact, if I were a DSMB member, that it's exactly the design I would have designed. That's not the point. It's whether I agree with the design, answering the questions of what's been put forth in front of me and my role in being a DSMB member. So sometimes that does happen. More often it's just kind of a misinterpretation of role. And once we express to them the things like Anna said about, the work that went in ahead of time, the sponsor decided that this is what they want the design to do, as far as maybe a futility stopping rule, this is where they want it to stop or they don't want it to stop. Of course, the DSMB is always going to make any recommendations based upon patient safety. Regardless of what the design has to do, they're going to make any recommendation they need to make to protect the safety of the participants in the trial. But emphasizing to them, this is what the sponsor wanted to keep going, or the sponsor wanted to be more aggressive on stopping for futility, and the sponsor understood the risks and the consequences with that when they designed the trial and signed on with it. And so the nice thing, also tying back to what Anna said about understanding the design, is when we're in closed session with them and let's say a trigger is hit for an action, we can further express to the DSMB of how this design process worked and how the sponsor, this is what they wanted to do, because both Anna and I have done the design and had that consulting experience and, can assure the DSMB that this is what happened in the design phase. And everyone's on board with this is what the trial is supposed to do because this is what they specified in the protocol.
Yeah. Do you find yourself at that point, adaptive design might, Anna talked about the predictive probability of success by the maximum sample size. Statistical quantities that drive it. Do you find yourself spending a good bit of time educating what goes into those numbers, the role of that? Is there almost, to them it might be a black box, and how important that role is to explain what it is they're looking at?
Yeah, we do. I think understanding those quantities, especially predictive probability, some DSMB members may not be as familiar with that quantity. If it's a predictive probability used for futility stopping, they may be more familiar with something like conditional power, and we can draw the comparisons of how this is, how this compares to conditional power, what this means. And again, that's the presenting the report to them in the closed session is very much the opportunity of we want them to ask questions. We want them to say, okay, what does this mean? Does this mean we went over it by a lot? Is this a strong evidence of doing the adaptation, a weaker evidence? How did these data anomalies factor into it? We're prepared to answer all those kind of questions. But yes, often there may be, or it may be like the model may be a more complex model at times, where we have to be able to describe how the model worked and what and influenced the model and influenced the result. And there's often a lot of questions on that.
Yeah, and I think we always like to think about how we're presenting results in our report. I think one of the things we pride ourselves in is creating a report that can be consumed, even by someone who's not a statistician, who maybe doesn't have familiarity with adaptive designs. But we spend a lot of time thinking about how can we show the data in a way that helps convey the roles that are being evaluated. How can we visualize what that predictive probability looks like and what it means? So we spend a lot of time trying to think about, not just are we over or under some threshold, but also can we help understand what that means, like Michelle was talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our reports are not just tables, lots of figures.
Yeah.
We try to emphasize the figures, and then
Yeah.
we'll write in words interpretations in there, just to help. Like Anna said, they can consume ahead of time during their review instead of coming to the meeting and having us need to explain it. So we try to make them very self-contained, self-absorbed for when the DSMB reviews them.
Yeah, I mean, boy, it sounds exciting. It sounds stressful to receive this data, Michelle. I know you're a big sports fan, Anna less so as a big sports fan, but it's that data coming in that sounds super exciting. It's incredibly important work to the success of trials, the treatment of patients, and it is the exact name of this podcast. You guys live in the interim. And appreciate you coming on. And as Michelle alluded to, we will talk about implementation of platform trials, which is other very interesting things to it. So very much enjoyed having you on in the interim.
Thanks.
Thanks. Great talking to you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.